Good afternoon. I'm Mahan Mirza, teaching professor at the Keough School and executive director of its Ansari Institute. Welcome both to our audience in the room and viewers online to the final event of our three-part series on the 20th anniversary of September the 11th, 2001. In case you missed it, you can watch parts 1 and 2 of the series on our website and YouTube channel. The first event featured a keynote by Andrew Bacevich. His remarks focused on American exceptionalism and the need for the US to develop a new paradigm for US foreign policy. Responding were Perrin Gurel, Jamila Afghani, and Ibrahim Musa. That panel also engaged what was, at that time, a rapidly evolving and uncertain situation in Afghanistan following the US's precipitous withdrawal after 2 decades of war. The second event was headlined by Elizabeth Hurd, who focused her remarks on the misguided entanglement of religion in US foreign policy. Responding were Atalia Omer and Ray Offenheiser, one through sophisticated theoretical frames of understanding religion, and the other through decades of field experience in humanitarianism and development. Today's event is titled Chaos or Community? What went wrong in the war on terror? What must we do now to make things right? And is that even possible, given the constellation of interests, institutions, and personalities at the helm of global affairs? Before inviting our panelists to engage these and related questions, we'd like to recognize the many sponsors of this series at the Keough School of Global Affairs, the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, along with the Keough Institute for International Studies, Clough Center for Civil and Human Rights, Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, and the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. Special thanks to David Courtwright and the Global Policy Initiative for leading this school-wide collaboration. After the keynote, today's 2 panelists will speak in this order. Nazia Kazi, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Stockton University, author of Islamophobia, Race, and Global Politics. Followed by Lisa Scherch, Richard G. Starman, Senior Visiting Professorship Chair in Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute, also a Senior Research Fellow at the Toda Institute and Senior Fellow with the Alliance for Peacebuilding. And now please welcome the Dean of the Keough School, Scott Appleby, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Professor Mirza. I'm really delighted that I can introduce our primary speaker here and this great panel that we have to address some of the themes that he and others will raise. Stephen Walt is one of the most influential and thoughtful experts on international relations more generally, upon the use of American military power, a number of related issues. He is a neo-realist, and the way I understand that term is the realist part is, yes, there's chaos, and we're not going to ever move away entirely from some element of chaos. But the neo part is we move toward community, and there's a return to a proper ordering, in my view, of military power and its role within U.S. foreign policy and international relations more generally. But the focus is on international cooperation, on community building, on non-military ways of solving problems. Stephen Walt is not the only person who has spoken to these issues, but he's done so with great clarity and influence. He is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School. Previously, he's taught at Princeton and the University of Chicago, a contributing editor to Foreign Policy magazine. He's co-chair of the editorial board of International Security. He's also a non-resident senior fellow of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which our previous speaker, Andrew Bacevich, is running. Walt is a scholar who has extended the boundaries of international relations theory through his emphasis, as I mentioned, on neorealism, the balance of power, the building of a global community of shared interest. His books include The Origin of Alliances and Taming American Power, the Global Response to U.S. Primacy. I had the privilege to review his 2007 book with John Mearsheimer, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. If you haven't read it, it's really a terrific book, far-sighted, courageous. I'll just note that both of those authors, Walt and Mearsheimer, predict in the book that even though it was an absolutely fair-minded, balanced, and responsible way for the U.S. to rethink its relationship to Israel and the Israel lobby, that they would come under ferocious attack by that lobby. And then we watched that unfold. It's a really very fine book. It was a New York Times bestseller. It's been translated, that book, into more than 20 foreign languages. Professor Walt's most recent book from 2018 is The Hell of Good Intentions, Americans' Foreign Policy Elite and the Defense of U.S. Primacy. Stephen Walt is a public intellectual. He's never, as well as a scholar, he's never hesitated to challenge the narrow-mindedness of political leaders, excuse me, and the vested interests that drive America's often self-defeating foreign and military policies. His 2019 article in Foreign Affairs is a good distillation of his themes: the end of hubris and the new age of American restraint. It reads as a diagnosis and a prescription for overcoming the failure of our country's overly militarized policies. Also valuable is his advice in that article to promote our values abroad by demonstrating democracy's virtues at home. We are really delighted that you're with us, Professor Walt, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to speak to you today. My topic, however, is not a particularly cheerful one. I'm going to try to discuss what I think went wrong with the war on terror. And perhaps the simplest way for me to proceed is simply to give you, in proper David Letterman fashion, my top 10 list of its worst negative effects. We can circle back to any of them in the discussion or to anything I've left out, and I'm sure there'll be things I've omitted here. So let me just start. Item number one, we should all remember that the war on terror was extremely costly in terms of both blood and treasure. The cost to the United States itself has been estimated at about $8 trillion over a 20-year period. But of course, that's going to extend into the future as we pay for veterans' costs and other expenses, pay for the loans that the money we borrowed to fight it. At least 15,000 Americans lost their lives in the war on terror. At least 750,000 non-Americans were killed as part of the war on terror. And the key point I'd emphasize here is this was a lot more than anybody expected back in 2001, 2002, when this all began. No one anticipated it would last this long and be so expensive. Item number two, the only tangible achievement, it seems to me, you can point to is that, yes, we didn't have another September 11th. This wasn't repeated. But of course, that actually wasn't very likely in any event, and almost certainly could have been prevented by better protective measures. All of the things we did through transportation security, through locking cockpit doors in airplanes, things like that. So the risk of another 9/11 was actually much smaller than we thought back then. And moreover, even if you include September 11th, American deaths from terrorism amount to a few thousand people over a 20-year period. We've seen over the last 2 years that deaths from a global pandemic have been about 750,000 Americans in 2 years. So we greatly exaggerated the threat that terrorism ultimately posed for us. It's also worth remembering that the war on terror did not stop Islamic extremism, did not create stable democracies in Iraq, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Yemen, Syria, did not slow the spread of weapons of mass destruction. North Korea went nuclear during the War on Terror, and Iran got much closer to having a nuclear weapons capability while the War on Terror was underway. So it cost a lot, item one, and it didn't achieve very much, item two. Number three, the War on Terror was used to justify a significant expansion of executive power, something Vice President Dick Cheney had wanted for a long time. And this had many dimensions: the use of torture, secret rendition, open-ended detentions at Guantanamo with no formal charges. All of this mostly kept out of sight until the abuses at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq came to light. We also saw warrantless surveillance by the National Security Administration, and it took a whistleblower, Edward Snowden, to reveal that to the American people. A rapid expansion of drone strikes and targeted killings under increasingly permissive rules. And under President Obama, this policy led to what were called signature strikes, where we killed people not because we knew they were dangerous, but because they fit a behavioral pattern that might be dangerous. There was also, in this expansion of executive power, a considerable lack of accountability, beginning with the September 11th Commission report, which held absolutely no one responsible for what happened there, except al-Qaeda. No Americans were named as having not prepared the country properly. No one was ever indicted for the crimes that were committed as part of the War on Terror, and in particular, the use of torture. Item number four, it made the perennial problem of threat inflation even worse, the tendency for Americans to exaggerate dangers. And the best illustration of this was Vice President Cheney's famous 1% doctrine, where he told his staff that if there was a 1% chance of something bad happening, you should assume it was a certainty. This is a perfect recipe for exaggerating dangers left and right. And of course, we saw the deliberate manipulation of information to justify the war in Iraq. Condoleezza Rice saying that we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud, implying that Iraq had nuclear weapons. Donald Rumsfeld telling the American people that we know Iraq has weapons of mass destruction because we know where they are. Of course, both those statements were false. Number five, the War on Terror led to what I would call an unhealthy veneration of the military. I think the military ought to be respected, but not revered. The United States was now permanently at war, and that made it increasingly difficult to criticize military leadership. We don't provide our veterans with adequate health care, but we do applaud them at ball games. In a break with tradition, two recent secretaries of defense were four-star generals. Previously, this had always been reserved for civilians. And so were two national security advisors, one under Obama and one under Trump. Senior military leaders now make millions of dollars in retirement, even when they've failed in battle or in leadership. This is not what George Marshall did, who once said that he didn't think it was appropriate for him to profit from his public service. But if you're a commander like David Petraeus, you can give classified information to your girlfriend, lie about it to the FBI, pay a fine, and remain a respected member of the foreign policy elite. And if you read books like Craig Whitlock's Afghanistan papers, it's quite clear that senior military and civilian officials were misleading the public about how the Afghanistan war was going, and doing so for years. No one was ever penalized for that. My point here is that when any institution is beyond criticism, that's bad for democracy. Number six, like most wars, dissent was marginalized in the War on Terror. People who said, for example, that we were attacked on September 11th in response to things we were doing in other parts of the world were viewed as unpatriotic. According to President Bush, we were attacked because they hate our freedoms, but there was abundant evidence, of course, that it wasn't our freedom that others hated. They didn't like certain aspects of American policy, but that was not something that was easy to say during the War on Terror. The Chief of Staff of the Army, Eric Shinseki, when he pointed out it would take 400,000 troops to occupy Iraq and pacify it, was dismissed as being wildly off the mark, and eventually he retired early. Just one more, a couple of more examples. In 2002, 33 American scholars published an ad in the New York Times declaring that war with Iraq was not in the US national interest. None of the people who signed that ad have ever been asked to serve in government subsequently. Lots of people who supported the war went on to find careers in the US government and remain, of course, respected experts now. Finally, in the last few months after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, there's been an orgy of media commentary, lots of it from people who got Afghanistan wrong all along, instead of having the media go and listen to people who got it right. So 60 Minutes interviewed former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, criticizing the Biden administration for its handling of the withdrawal, but didn't bother to interview anyone who had correctly pointed out that the war was unwinnable. Number 7, and I think the previous speakers have mentioned this encouraged a very Manichaean us versus them view, formed in racial and religious terms. Both President Bush and President Obama did make modest efforts to say this was not, say, a war against Islam, but in practice, and especially in popular commentary, this was in fact portrayed as a conflict between Muslim persons of color and everyone else. Donald Trump certainly exploited this, as did a number of other politicians. The FBI, of course, focused its investigations on Muslim communities, which meant they weren't paying attention to the real problem, which were white supremacists who were starting to gravitate towards terrorist methods as well. And if you read Spencer Ackerman's recent book, Reign of Terror, it's quite clear that the war on terror began to blow back into the US political system and led to a number of abuses that we've now been focused on in the last couple of years. I'm almost done. Number 8, language of the war. The language we used in the war on terror was costly in itself. Terror is just a tactic. It's a tactic that groups all across the political spectrum have used at different times. So we had, in effect, declared war on a tactic. It's like declaring war on blockading or declaring war on combined arms operations. It also gave al-Qaeda and others more status than they deserved. They became combatants, soldiers, heroes and martyrs in a cause, instead of being depicted as marginal figures, fanatics, criminals, threats to public order, threats to their own societies as much as to ours. And of course, terrorism became a label that governments around the world could use to go after their political opponents, just by accusing them or labeling them a terrorist. Number 9. The war on terror was a giant distraction from things that really mattered more. It distracted us from thinking about how we were going to deal with the rise of China. It distracted us from the opioid crisis here at home. It distracted us from the gradual erosion of democratic institutions happening at home. It distracted us from the deep corruption within the financial industry that produced the 2008-9 financial crisis. And of course, it distracted us from the long-term threat we face from climate change. Now, the war on terror is not solely responsible for that, but it clearly played a role. Last but not least, number 10, the war on terror also distorted our work here in academia. And this is an old story. It created a cottage industry of scholars studying terrorism, jihadism, various things like that. The Defense Department itself got into the act by giving so-called Minerva grants, which I think compromises academic independence in a number of ways. And I want to emphasize here, there was some very good work here done by a number of scholars, but I think in general, it tended to shift the security studies field, at least, too far in one direction, too far onto one topic, because that's where the money was, at least for a while. To sum all this up, the main point I'd emphasize is these were all self-inflicted wounds. It wasn't what al-Qaeda did to us. The damage we suffered on September 11th was tragic, but ultimately not a threat to the American way of life, not a threat to our society, certainly not an existential danger. Rather, it was what we did to ourselves, mostly in other places, mostly abroad, but in some ways also here at home. That's what's done the most damage and the most lasting damage. So Al-Qaeda didn't win the war on terror, we lost it. And the question now is whether we can learn from this experience, learn from what is ultimately a strategic defeat. And on that score, I'm afraid I'm not optimistic. The way in which the country has reacted, say, to the withdrawal from Afghanistan does not suggest that we're learning the right lessons from the experience. If that's the case, we are bound to repeat them again. Thanks very much for listening. I hope I've provided enough material for a lively discussion. I look forward to the comments.
Thanks so much. You know, there's this joke, congratulations to drugs for winning the war on drugs. You know, when it comes to the war on terror, it seems terror may have won. We know now that 37 million people have been displaced because of the US war on terror. We know that the official death count from the drone warfare program reflects a dramatic undercount, because you see the US has counted adult Muslim men as enemy combatants instead of as civilians. So as we look back on these 2 decades and as we reflect on these remarks, here's what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't see the US response to 9/11 as a mistake, an error, or a miscalculation. We shouldn't regard America's corrosive foreign policy practices as these sort of freakish anomalies. And this kind of oops approach to American empire building, what Michael Parenti has called the bumbling empire approach, it prevents us from seeing the sort of careful and deliberate systems that guide American statecraft. Instead, and we can see this from today's talk, we ought to interpret the US response to 9/11 with a persistent and unrelenting focus on imperialism. After September 11th, 2001, Glenn Beck, the conservative commentator, spoke of this spirit of 9/12. He meant the sense of unity and togetherness that shaped the US following the attacks. Hillary Clinton would also refer to the spirit of 9/12 when she ran for president in 2016, saying we ought to return to the spirit of 9/12. Paul Krugman, New York Times columnist, wrote the following tweet last fall. Brace yourself. He said, Americans took 9/11 pretty calmly. Notably, there wasn't a mass outbreak of anti-Muslim sentiment and violence, which could have all too easily happened. Okay, so somebody tell our boy Krugman that 20 years after 9/11, the detention center at Guantanamo Bay remains open. This is a Muslims-only prison. And at this detention center, all forms of torture have taken place. For instance, blasting Britney Spears songs on maximum volume for days at a time during interrogations, temperature torture, sleep torture, sexual torture. And of course, this detention center has to exist over there, right? Away from American constitutional protections. And someone tell Krugman that now the Biden administration is poised to turn the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center into a migrant facility for Haitian migrants, right? Haiti, a country that has seen countless meddling by the US, regime change operations, economic warfare, election interference, whether under Democratic or Republican leadership. So between Krugman's tweet and Clinton and Glenn Beck's celebration of the spirit of 9/12, what we see is a serious rewriting of history going on. I mean, I think there was a spirit of 9/12, but it was a sinister one. At the time of the attacks on September 11th, 2001, Howard Stern was on air and he interrupted his radio show to say, you know, we need to do some atom bomb hits. Don't ask any questions, some chemical attacks, and let's kick the towelhead bastards out of our country. Then, to quote Howard Stern, we can take the oil for ourselves. Was this the spirit of 9/12? Right up until the attacks, George W. Bush had some of the lowest approval ratings of any recent US president. But immediately after September 11th, 2001, his approval rating skyrocketed, setting records well beyond that of the last several presidents. And with this new approval rating, with an American population just in the grips of fear, Bush was able to reshuffle the American economy in confounding ways. And we ought to remember this. You know, people typically understand September 11th as this political event, a terrorist attack, but we must remember it as an economic event as well. That after September 11th, the Bush administration, with its newfound popularity, was able to reshuffle the American economy, to redistribute wealth upward, to pour money into the coffers of the ruling elite, you know, through bailouts, tax breaks, deregulation, and more. Was this the spirit of 9/12? We were reminded in today's talk about the war on terror's distortion of academia. And it wasn't just academia. It was the spawning of a whole system of American education from the K through 12 level that was really reshuffled to reflect this new terror age. Nicole Nguyen has written about the curriculum of fear, through which American public schools that are increasingly cash strapped, these public schools solve their budgetary problems by partnering with the Department of Homeland Security or Lockheed Martin or Raytheon. And their defense industry partners will help fund science labs, math curricula. And now ninth graders learn parabolas through hypothetical math problems about North Korean missiles. 10th graders take classes called Foundations of Homeland Security. In my home city of Philadelphia, the city has sponsored gentrification by offering tax abatements to people who buy new homes. So the schools are underfunded, and now they turn to Boeing and Raytheon to sponsor their science labs. Now, for those who do go on to college, they may or may not be aware of the role the CIA or the Pentagon plays on their campuses, sponsoring research agendas, recruiting students, shaping the campus experience in profound and troubling ways. So today's students have this security mindset, the notion that there's a terror threat lurking around every corner and that the US state ought to continually fight. I mean, I agree with Professor Walt. The real threats that face us cannot be solved with an $800 billion military budget. They cannot be solved through the proliferation of secret CIA torture sites around the world. And they cannot be solved by putting more border patrol at the US-Mexico border. I mean, the real threats that face us, medical debt, climate crises, the runaway costs of housing, these are byproducts of the systematic disinvestment in American lives and the hyperinvestment in the military-industrial complex. I will never stop being amazed that Biden's administration has pledged $16 billion this year to the Space Force branch of the US military at the very time that the pandemic has threatened the lives and livelihoods of millions of Americans. But there exists in the US a whole industry of remembering 9/11, right? Never forget. In the midst of the COVID pandemic, you can buy a face mask from the 9/11 museum gift shop that has never forget embroidered across it. And this is at a time when the coronavirus was killing as many people as died on 9/11 every day. After 9/11, pieces of steel beam from the Twin Towers were packaged and shipped around the world. And today there are schools, museums, and military bases that have these physical pieces of the Twin Towers as memorial sites for 9/11. But I think it's worthwhile to think about never forget through a critical lens. On the one hand, we Americans remember 9/11 vividly, crisply. We can all close our eyes and probably see very similar images of the footage of September 11th, 2001, the most broadcast television event in history. And yet our collective understanding of the attacks, who carried them out, what led to them, and what followed, is vague. It's been erased. These things aren't quite as vivid as that which we are told to never forget. Very few K through 12 lessons include any formal lesson at all about September 11th. And when American classrooms do have 9/11 lessons, they are all about sentimental American victimhood. You know, the portraits of families who lost a loved one. Often 9/11 classroom lessons are connected to the study of American exceptionalism. You learn about September 11th on the same day you learn, what makes the Constitution such a fabulous document. In American classrooms, 9/11 lessons include decorating red, white, and blue cupcakes or making an American flag. That is the bulk of classroom lessons about September 11th. You would be hard-pressed to find an American classroom lesson about NSEERS, the National Security Entry-Exit Registry System, basically a program of profiling and detaining Muslim migrants. You would be hard-pressed to find a classroom lesson about Abu Ghraib and the systematic sexual torture that took place there. And you would be hard-pressed to find a classroom lesson about the 500,000 children who starved from hunger because of US sanctions on Iraq before the war on terror, a loss that Madeleine Albright, you will recall, said was well worth it. So never forget is this brand name that actually asks us to forget, that asks us to forget that we live at the heart of an empire, that we forget that American militarism is always at work, hard at work, in places we might not expect, shaping the research agendas at elite institutions, recruiting from working class neighborhoods, vetting and reviewing Hollywood films, showing off weaponry at sporting events, and constructing a global chain of military bases around the world that inspire protests from local communities. So today's talk reminds us that we need to demand a more appropriate memory, a more nuanced memory, a more contextual memory than what this flat slogan, never forget, asks of us. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kazi, Dr. Walt. I think we find agreement here on the panel today. And this whole series has been asking us, what did 9/11 do to our society? Well, it brought neo-realists and neo-idealists together, where we agree and we share a critique really of both Democrats and Republicans and their response to 9/11. So it's not a partisan discussion or debate. This is really about the facts, evidence-based policies, truth-telling, and reality. I want to respond point by point to Dr. Walt's presentation. He gave 10 points. I'm going to combine his point 1 and 9. He talked about the cost of war and what a distraction the war on terror has been for us. So he talked about the $8 trillion opportunity cost, really that can be directly linked now to climate change, which, as we know from this week's conversations, the world needs $8 trillion to address this tremendous catastrophe happening to our entire planet. Dr. Kazi mentioned this Brown University cost of war data set, which is including the number of people displaced by the war on terror, not by terrorism, by the war on terror, 38 million as of August 2021. How do we, in the years ahead, we're going to be having climate migrants, climate refugees. We know vast portions of our planet are going to be uninhabitable. So I don't think we can actually calculate the cost of the war on terror at this point, because the opportunity cost, the trade-off cost is so massive. We spent 20 years of our lives, even as Dr. Walt points out, academics studying violent extremism and terrorism instead of studying climate change and the climate catastrophe unfurling on our planet. The second point Dr. Walt makes is the lack of tangible achievements. And this is really the only point that I want to object a little bit to what Dr. Walt says. Because I worked in both Afghanistan and Iraq on the ground, I see that those wars did give space for civil society to organize and to breathe in a way that they didn't under the Taliban, particularly in Afghanistan. So there are benefits to girls' education, for example, and a generation of women who have gotten educated in Afghanistan. But the point that really I object to is thinking that somehow Afghans don't want democracy, or that there's something unnatural about Afghans and democracy, that it was a lost cause, that the war was never going to work there. And I think that's a failure of understanding the critique of it was the top-down approach that was the mistake. It's not that Afghans are not looking for democratic participation in their government or human rights or women's rights. It's not that the US was completely imposing these ideas on Afghanistan. It's the way it was done, what we chose to support, and how money was directed. That's the only point of disagreement I had with Dr. Walt. The third point he made is the expansion of executive power. And I think here we can equally look at the Biden administration, the Obama administration, as well as the Republican administrations. We have a real problem of accountability, of checks and balances, and the threat to our democracy. As Dr. Kazi noted, what this really is doing is giving more airspace to the military industrial complex. Dr. Eisenhower, when he laid out the threat that the military industrial complex posed to our society, posed to our security, I think he underestimated what would be happening in 2021. Yes, can you hear me now? So the expansion of executive power, I was relating it to the military industrial complex and saying that this real threat wasn't mentioned by Dr. Walt, but I think that we have to have discussions on how the military industrial complex impacted our policymaking in response to 9/11 and how you even see it working today, so that the very people who were predicting the failure of the war on terror are continuing to be silenced. And there's just sort of a lack of analysis that war makers have a profit incentive. And so as long as war is profit making for people, we're going to have a hard time stopping policymakers from being embroiled in decisions about their campaign finances. The fourth point Dr. Walt makes is about threat inflation. And I just wanted to add to his critique here, a critique of the media on the left, on the right, the CNN effect of 24/7 threat inflation, where people, increasingly just sit by their TVs, and terrorism is like a moneymaker for journalists and for the media. Journalists have a saying, if it bleeds, it leads. And that goes on the psychology. If there's an accident on the side of the highway, people stop and they look at it. That's our human nature. It's our part of our psychology. So when CNN puts on terror news, people's cortisol in their bodies goes up. Their attention is heightened. We have to blame the media and journalists for keeping our attention focused on terror and hijacking our brains, actually, to keep us in this constant state of fear. The fifth point Dr. Walt makes is veneration of the military. I think we have to also address Hollywood with this. This is a cultural challenge. The Pentagon has an office in Hollywood that promotes this type of military veneration. We are fed a diet of the fantasy of firepower solutions, and the military wins every time. Dune, the movie, is just only the recent manifestation of this, and it really can be seen as exactly coming off of what happened in Afghanistan. Hollywood has also been irresponsible in not telling the story of scholarly evidence that nonviolent action and social movements that are for democracy work. And we know that this can be very powerful because Hollywood did make the movie Gandhi. And that movie, that one Hollywood film, has impacted so many social movements around the world. People in Chile credit it for starting this social movement there, in El Salvador, in South Africa, Cambodia. That movie inspires people. If Hollywood was showing more people the power of nonviolent resistance instead of the fantasy of firepower solutions, I think we would be seeing more people power movements around the world for the democracy that the US says that it would like to see. Dr. Walt, in one of his recent op-eds in Foreign Policy, says trying to turn Afghanistan into a liberal democracy was always an impossible dream. And that's the point, again, that I wanted to critique. But I think that I've said that already, so let me skip that part. Finally, in terms of this veneration of the military, Congress's trust in the military means that DoD not only lacks accountability for failure, it means that military commanders in Afghanistan were given loads of cash, literally bags of cash, to buy or rent the allegiance of local leaders. And that money is, responsible for so much of the corruption. But what was strange, as somebody who was lobbying in Congress at the same time for more money to support Afghan peace builders, is how stingy Congress was to even give money to the State Department for peace building activities or any type of peace process that the State Department would lead. And in the military's defense, I had military generals going with me to Congress to make the argument together. Here's a scholar in peace building, and a military general telling Congress where the money needed to go. And Congress's fantasy of firepower and veneration of the military would refuse to even listen to that argument. All right, so the marginalization of dissent and the question of why do they hate us and why we haven't gotten back to that self-reflection question, I think Dr. Walt is right on mark, and we can still do that work. I think the whole decoloniality movement is really about why do they hate us? It's a much longer conversation that we should have been having in the weeks and months after 9/11. We can have it now. Point 7, the us versus them, you know, when Bush said you're either with us or against us, that paradigm of thinking, that sort of phrase has sunk into the American consciousness. You hear President Trump, former President Trump, now saying the very same things about Americans. You're either with us or against us. And, you know, watching the feeds on Facebook on this, it's increasingly dividing Americans and turning us against ourselves. I'm going to skip to the last point of academia, because really here we are still talking about 9/11. And I think Dr. Walt's challenge to us is that, you know, 9/11 has hijacked us. We need to be talking about a broader range of human security, human safety concerns. I think climate change is the top of those, but Dr. Courtwright here at Notre Dame is leading an effort to help us think about a security paradigm for the future. And I think, you know, at some point we need to like put 9/11 to rest, learn the lessons, say most of us were ignored. We said all this literally in the weeks after 9/11. We're saying it again 20 years later. Now let's just be bold and brave and talk about security for a new century. Thank you.
Thanks to our speakers. Professor Walt, give you an opportunity to respond to anything you heard before we open it up to the audience.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I thought the comments were both really thought-provoking and well worth thinking about. Let me just be really quick here. So with respect to Nazia's comments, I think we do have a sort of fundamental disagreement. We're critical of the same things, but there is a question of sort of intentionality, I guess, built into it. So I do think much of the war on terror was a mistake. It was a blunder. It was foolish. It was not a carefully, systematically orchestrated plot by a bunch of evil men and women. And one way to think about it is if you were trying to expand the American empire, if you really thought American dominance around the world was really important, very valuable, morally desirable, et cetera, if you thought all of those things, then most of what we did with the war on terror was incredibly counterproductive. On those terms, if that had been your goal, what you did was squandered a lot of power, squandered a lot of influence, made the country look bad in the eyes of many others around the world. So not only, you know, to use the old line, not only was it a crime, it was a blunder. And I think it was a blunder by a number of people who thought they were actually doing something quite different. That's in the sense in which I think it was a mistake as well. With respect to Lisa's comments, I mean, one place we obviously disagree is the American role in Afghanistan. And I guess I agree with her. There were many things that were done wrong. What we were trying to accomplish there was well-intentioned. And some of the things we did do, expanding civil society, certainly promoting women's rights, were highly desirable in and of themselves. But the more you try to change a society from the outside, even though there are some people within that society who are sympathetic and supportive, the more you try to do that and the more rapidly you try to do that, the more you are likely to trigger various adverse reactions, lots of unintended consequences, effects you simply cannot fully anticipate. So my fear is that, if we tried to run the Afghan intervention and subsequent state building operation 10 times, and we did it slightly differently each time, we would still fail 9 out of those 10 times. Not that we weren't trying to accomplish the right thing, and not that we didn't make progress in some areas, but that ultimately the fate of Afghanistan was going to be determined by Afghans and not by the international community, to include the United States. That is not to say that we didn't make, of course, lots and lots of mistakes over that 20-year period and never came to terms with them as well. Finally, the comment about the role of the military. I mean, first of all, anytime you're in a war, your national security institutions become politically more powerful. And that's one of the reasons you want to be very careful about getting into wars. It's one of the things the founding fathers were actually very worried about. That the more that you couldn't stay a free society if you were constantly at war, and certainly the fact that Congress, to a large extent, has abdicated many of its responsibilities in recent years to provide oversight, to provide dissenting views, I think is absolutely right. The fact that they were never willing to revisit the authorization to use military force in 2001 and 2002, and just continued to let the executive branch invoke this. By the way, invoked by both Democratic and Republican presidents to expand the war on terror in various ways, suggests the degree to which Congress is no longer an appropriate check. Finally, the last point that Lisa made about, we have to be able to move past this. I think yes and no. My fear is that we will learn some lessons from this experience temporarily, and then we'll forget them rather quickly and go on and make similar mistakes in the future. But I also do worry a little bit that the 9/11 experience, and certainly many of the adverse features of it, will become sort of like the old Munich analogy, right? The idea that, this one experience in 1938 in Europe casts a shadow over American foreign policy then throughout much of the Cold War. I worry that in 2050, 2060, September 11th will still be seen as this extraordinarily illuminating experience, will serve as the template for how the United States needs to deal with various challenges. And we ought to be wary of the fact that sometimes particular historical incidents take on a life of their own. So I think it is extremely important to try and make sure that the right historical lessons and the right framing of that experience is the one that the society internalizes, and not one that will get us into more trouble down the road. Let me stop there and look forward to what the audience may have to say.
Thank you. I see questions already coming in the audience. I also discerned a very interesting debate here that we can develop further, and there are also some questions coming in online. I just request you to come to the microphone to ask your question for the benefit of the online audience. Professor Powers.
On the question of imperialism, I agree that we have to be careful with how we use that term. But both supporters of the Iraq intervention in 2003, like Gaddis, and opponents like Nye, both agreed with the National Security Strategy of 2002, which said that preventive war is tied to a strategy of US military, political, and economic dominance, and maintaining that kind of dominance. So was it really not connected in some way to something that might be called neo-imperialism?
If that's a question to me, a couple of points. I believe my friend and colleague Joe Nye did not oppose the Iraq War. He did not support it vocally. I think he said at one point he was sort of 51-49, but he was not, prior to the war, a vocal opponent. I do think that for many of the people who supported it, and this was a bipartisan war, Barack Obama was about the only member of his own cabinet who had opposed the war publicly. I do think the Iraq War was a consequence of that belief in American indispensability. very much the lesson people had drawn from Afghanistan. Remember, the Afghan war went very well from an American perspective the first couple of months, and that gave Americans this sense that the American military was something magical, that it could go in, remove someone like Saddam Hussein, do it quickly, do it cheaply, and then come home. And nobody, not even people like me who opposed the war all along, thought it was going to be a militarily difficult task to remove Saddam Hussein, which it wasn't. The problem was that that was step one, and there was a set of consequences that were going to follow from that. And that we didn't know how to do. The fact that the war was also illegal, et cetera, there were other reasons to be opposed to it, but it wasn't that it was militarily challenging. And so it was a degree of overconfidence in what a military power in general, and in particular, what American military power could accomplish, that I think led many people, including people in the Democratic Party, to go along with this. Just one final comment here, that I believe the experience of the first Gulf War back in 1991 was in the minds of many American policymakers. And by that, I mean the fact that there in 1991, we actually had a serious national debate over whether or not war to liberate Kuwait was a good idea or not. Many people wanted sanctions. Famously, Sam Nunn, influential Democrat, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, opposed the war and later said that that was the end of his presidential ambitions, because he opposed the war, and then the war was seen as this great military victory, etc. I believe there were people in 2002, 2003 who remembered that, and they did not want to be in a position of standing up against a war, because what if it goes well? And they will look bad. And I think that led many people, whatever their interviews were, to go along with it, especially in the aftermath of what had happened on September 11th.
You know, I think this is where we can return to the question of memory, which is so important if we're going to take seriously this question of empire. If we start, the conversation on Iraq in 2002, 2003, or in 1990 for that matter, we miss a deep history that tells us a lot more, and a critical piece of the conversation that was missing in 2003. If in 2003 you said, what about Abdul Karim Qasim, most Americans would stare at you blankly. But the fact of the matter is that the US didn't just have a key alliance with Saddam Hussein for decades. No, it's that the US sought him out and created his political career in order to topple the sort of democratic and progressive ambitions of Abdul Karim Qasim, right, in 1963. So literally a decade after the CIA had done the same thing through Operation Ajax in Iran next door. And this kind of deep history is really what was missing from the sort of anti-war and pro-war debates that were raging in 2003. And I think when you allow for this deeper perspective, you can begin to think seriously about this question of empire. In the first Gulf War, the anti-war movement was split. I mean, there were people who were saying no war on Iraq, and then there were others in the anti-war movement who were saying no war on Iraq, sanctions. And it took that other contingent of the anti-war movement to more appropriately categorize themselves as anti-imperialist and to recognize that sanctions are themselves a form of economic warfare, and that we ought to understand, the kinds of hybrid war, to borrow from Vijay Prashad, that shape US foreign policy, right? And so when we sort of zoom out and take these more contextual views, I think the fact of empire building becomes more and more obvious.
I would like to add something to this, because I think the empire paradigm influences how we think about the capacity of local people to be their own advocates for democracy or women's rights. And so I wanted to come back, Dr. Walt, because I think you misunderstood my point. And that is that the women's rights, the human rights, the education's advances that were made in Afghanistan were not because of the US. They happened in spite of the US. There are thousands of Afghan women working for Afghan rights. you know, the whole conversation in Washington, D.C. was that there was a lack of capacity and that there was no civil society, and we had to do these things for them, and we just couldn't find enough local partners. This was total mythology. If you went to Kabul, there were hundreds and thousands of people, and we know that now because we saw them at the airport on CNN trying to leave the country, and they're still trying to leave the country. There are so many thousands of Afghans who are capable human rights workers, women's rights workers, that we were in the way of. You know, we posed obstacles as the US trying to enforce these things. We created a little bit of space where they were allowed to lead their own campaigns, and that's who I want to credit for, you know, the future, I think, also. And that's why I think we need to be thinking about how do we help these Afghans outside of the country continue their work.
Come on up.
I just have a brief question for each one of you. What would your ideal U.S. Department of Defense look like?
Climate change mitigation.
I guess they could return to their previous name, the Department of War, so that the American public could decide more appropriately how they want to relate to this.
It's a great question. I'd say off the top of my head, it'd be about 2/3 the size that it currently is. I wouldn't object to the name change, and I would not declare it to be part of climate change, because I think they would hijack the agenda in all the wrong ways, which is not to say that we don't need to be much more seriously focused on that problem, because it's going to have a much greater effect on the well-being of both Americans, but others around the world than the outcome of any particular geopolitical tussle in the next, 40, 50 years.
If we're going to be hijacked, it's probably best to be hijacked by an agenda that's challenging climate change. This is all very interesting. Any other questions? Yes, please.
So I heard this is the third one I have attended, and as a lawyer, the problem for me is always enforcement. So I want to understand what all you think what US should have responded then after the 9/11, because no one has ever mentioned what the US government should have done then, which should have been accepted to American public and, somewhat not be politically fatal for the president then.
I'll take the first swing at that. It's actually a fascinating question to ask the counterfactual. Could the United States have responded to 9/11 in a more intelligent way? And I think the answer is almost clearly yes. Of course, we could have. We might disagree on how likely that was. I think Nazia probably believes that the chances we would have responded to it intelligently were, 1 chance in 1,000. And I think the chances were higher, that it's a tragedy that we acted as we did. But I think the United States and many of its allies around the world and some of its adversaries around the world should have focused in a very limited way on the organization that had attacked the United States, and by the way, had conducted attacks in other countries as well. We should have focused laser-like on Al-Qaeda and said, we want to capture as many of these people as possible and then hold them, bring them to justice by holding trials. And if they're found guilty, then we punish them appropriately. They should have been not labeled as enemy combatants, but they should have been labeled as criminals, because what they had done had been a violation of both domestic and international law. Full stop. We should not have declared that our campaign was against all terrorists of global reach, which was the phrase that the Bush administration used. We should not have used this as an excuse to then wage a war that had nothing to do with September 11th. And here I mean the war on Iraq. We should not have then decided we were going to go after every violent extremist movement we could locate in various parts of the world, et cetera, et cetera. So there are ways we could have approached this, and we would have, I think, consistently damped the rhetoric down about how we were discussing that this was a an unfortunate thing that had happened to the United States, but we were a large, powerful, mature country that was not going to freak out as a result of this, that rather we were going to take a measured response to it, do various things at home to make it harder for something like this to happen to us again. And last, and very importantly, and I think this is the place where Nazia and Lisa and I all agree, we should have asked ourselves the question, is there something we're doing in various parts of the world that might have led this to happen? Did we do something not intending this to happen? Maybe inadvertently, let's at least ask that question. Now, it's possible, having asked that question, we might then decide as a country, we're going to keep doing those things. We accept now that part of the price of, say, our entire Middle East policy, the various countries there that we're supporting, part of the price of doing that is that some people in that part of the world are going to be very angry at us and are going to try to make us pay a price for it. But we're willing to bear that price because we really believe in those policies, whatever you want to, whichever policies you want to point to. We never even wanted to have that discussion, that maybe there was something we were doing that had led this to happen, and we wanted to ask ourselves whether or not we wanted to continue to do that. My view is that, yes, there were things we were doing that provoked this. Al-Qaeda was quite clear about that, and we should have then asked, which of our policies are we willing to change? And by the way, we were willing to change some of them. Right? One of bin Laden's big objections was the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia. We took them out. We didn't advertise it very loudly, but we did. So we did adjust some of our policies. We just didn't want to have the broader conversation about the extent to which we bore not moral responsibility necessarily for what had happened, but causal responsibility.
I couldn't agree more with this point about asking questions. And I'm not being overly, vague here. I mean, returning to what Howard Stern said on air that morning, he said, let's do these atom bomb hits. Now is not the time to ask questions. And it's not an exaggeration to say that this post 9/11 moment in the US was not a time to ask questions. You were not allowed to raise the question of how the US, armed and trained, say, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar in Afghanistan, who threw acid in the faces of women who didn't cover their face. You were not allowed to raise the question of the decades-long alliance between Saddam Hussein and the United States as the US gave him the chemical weapons during the Iran-Iraq war. It was not a time to ask questions, So Mustafa Bayoumi says one of the key ingredients of the war on terror was stupidity, that there was a regime of stupidity that was necessary, that was the key ingredient for the war on terror. And, nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, the climate of fear, and, Naomi Klein has written about the shock doctrine and how when populations are scared or in a state of shock, they stop asking questions. And that really happened. I mean, you would think that there would have been riots in the streets when we learned that the FBI was monitoring what books we check out from the library after September 11th, 2001. And no such thing happened, I think another thing is the US should not have used this carceral imperialism, carceral technologies. We know, for instance, that Halliburton, in the early days of the war on terror, constructed a global archipelago of secret sites, black sites, off the books sort of locations where torture and interrogation and rendition took place. And that this sort of reliance on incarceration trickled down. And, I don't believe in trickle down economics, but I do believe in trickle down militarism, that we ended up seeing black sites in American cities, such as in Holman Square in Chicago, where very similar technologies to those used by the CIA abroad were used here in the US. And we have to be really aware of the relationship between, global militarism and, American racism domestically.
So I have a question from online, and I'm going to frame it in a way that invites each of you to maybe say your concluding sort of thoughts for today. But don't leave after that. There'll be an inclination to just applause, and that's it. Because I have a brief announcement after that, and then Professor David Courtright is going to conclude this series for us. So The question I have from online says, in what way is the US military controlling academia? Is it hampering independence of thought and intellectual freedom? And I just want to adjust this question a little bit because I didn't hear controlling, I heard influencing. And when you aggregate influences across sectors like we saw in Hollywood, you get a net result in society that makes certain outcomes inevitable. And so I think that's at the heart of the debate here today as well. On the one hand, what happened after 9/11 was our response was dumb, it was unserious, but it could have been different. And on the other hand, if I can just put the debate in stark terms, yes, it was dumb and unserious, but it couldn't have been any different because there's a certain logic of empire that was unavoidable. So engage this thought in your concluding maybe minute or so, and then we'll invite Professor Courtwright to conclude the series. We'll begin with Lisa, and then Nazia, and Dr. Walt, you get the last word.
I was going to suggest the reverse order, but okay. I mean, I think that I don't want a conversation about 9/11 to focus only on US interests and capacities here. Like for me, being on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan, there are people on the ground in other countries who want change to happen. And we're asking actually for the US military. So I remember hearing their voices too. And I think we need to remember their voices in the room, that people want change. They want more human rights. They want more democracy. Maybe not the free market and some of the other things that come on with liberal peace building, but somehow we have to have a way of supporting social movements in other countries, people looking for change. And for me, that's what I am taking forward. And how are we going to do that in the decades ahead?
You know, the university is such a contradictory space. I mean, on the one hand, you see remarkable movements against militarism, against imperialism in campus settings. And on the other hand, you see the entrenchment of the military-industrial complex in university settings. So whether that is the Pentagon and the CIA explicitly funding research agendas, physics professors, homeland security curricula in universities. Giraud has written extensively about the militarization of the American university in really interesting ways. And this is a contradiction I take seriously. But I think we can't underestimate the ways in which American militarism sort of hides in plain sight. Yesterday we had a conversation about how, on Oscar Sunday last year, the Department of Defense openly stated on Twitter, did you know the Department of Defense reviews and vets Hollywood scripts? And my thought was, how can you guys say that out loud? That there is a literal office in the CIA whose job it is to vet and review scripts for films, and not just films that are explicitly about the military, but sometimes frivolous romantic comedies, sometimes episodes of Cupcake Wars, are vetted and reviewed by the CIA. We know that the original version of Charlie Wilson's War was an anti-war film. And after the Department of Defense got their hands on the script, it was rewritten to be largely pro-state. So American militarism pops up in such strange places, whether it's sporting events, public schools, academia, entertainment media, art, and we have to be extremely vigilant about this.
Yeah, I think vigilance is called for. I would have objected to the phrase controlling academia. I don't think the military-industrial complex controls it, but it does have influence, and that influence is often extremely subtle. So we've already heard reference to part of it. I think major donors to universities, and by that I mean mostly alumni, have greater impact than the military-industrial complex does, even though you can find ways in which money gets into universities. I have students from the military in my classes. I have senior fellows at the research centers I've connected with who are former generals, former CIA officials as well. And I like that because I learned from them. I can talk to them in various ways. I have friends who have gotten money, gotten grants from the Defense Department to do various projects at various points. I have never done anything like that. And one of the reasons I don't is that it's very easy to get addicted to this. It's very easy to get addicted also to access. It's fun to be in the room when a bunch of powerful and important people are sitting and talking about their experiences. It's nice to get invited down to Washington to consult with a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who suddenly thinks he wants your advice on something. That's very flattering. That's the kind of thing that I think academics are not immune to. I have had friends who were advising the commanders in Afghanistan. We get to fly over there on VIP tours, and that's fun to do. You can come home and talk to your colleagues about you've just come in from Kabul and what you saw there, etc. And I just want to warn academics that there is some value in this, but there is a danger in it too, that suddenly the next time you're about to write something critical about ways, so what the commander is doing in Afghanistan, you say, well, gee, am I going to lose my access? Am I going to not get invited to that next meeting in Washington? Am I going to be seen as a critic rather than a sympathetic figure? So the ways in which powerful institutions influence academia are subtle and manifold. And I agree, eternal vigilance is the price of academic freedom.
Professor Kazi has agreed to join us, some of us informally. If you grab your lunch outside, we'll meet upstairs in room 4150. It's the lounge of the Ansari Institute where we can carry on this conversation further. And please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. We're not done. Please give a couple of minutes to Professor David Courtwright, who will bring this series to a close.
Well, thank you, Mahan, and thank you, Dean Appleby, and all those who've been participating in this series for a really great set of programs. The discussions have been tremendously stimulating, informative, but really this is only the beginning. We can't just end here, I believe, in discussing these issues, because so many of the risks that we've identified continue. The 10 points, the consequences of those are still with us. And if you think about current policies, the Pentagon budget is going up $750 billion and even more. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have come to an end in terms of US direct involvement, but operations and drone strikes are continuing in many countries. So many of these policies, especially alarming, the increased Cold War approach towards China and possible military confrontation with China, the dangers are many. And I think it's incumbent upon us to try to address that. And I go back to the kind of opening remarks from Andrew Bacevich when he talked about 9/11 and these anniversaries of the Afghanistan war as a wake-up call and a time for us to start a national conversation and to create that new paradigm, a different approach to American policy. So we've started to do that, actually. We put together a proposal for the Provost's Moment to See, Courage to Act initiative here on campus. And we're reaching out to the Quincy Institute and to other universities and hope to create a process of research and policy analysis for several years, I hope, that can carry forward this discussion. And we're looking at a number of specific activities, research to really address the costs of these militarized policies over the last 20 years. Not just the direct costs, as Professor Walt was identifying, but the indirect costs, the opportunity costs of neglecting so many other priorities. Also to identify what are the alternative policies. What is the force posture for the United States to abandon these imperialist policies and actually protect our people, but then be cooperative and supportive of other efforts to try to prevent conflict around the world. We also need, I think, to address the ethical and legal issues. This doctrine of preventative war, of preemption, it's discredited, but it's still the policy of the United States. And we need to understand the context of that and develop an ethical policy around military restraint and about greater international cooperation. We really need, I think, also to engage with the veterans community. We have a good number of veterans right here on campus. We've been reaching out to them. We have our Military and Veterans Office. They're the ones who have borne this burden of wars over the last 20 years for all the rest of us in society, and they're paying a huge price. And we have to ensure that they have the care and long-term support they need, but also that our country never again sends our men and women into wars or conflicts that are not worthy of their mission, that are not worthy of their values and of their commitment to American justice. And then to think about the opportunity that's coming up, the 20th anniversary of the war in Iraq provides an opportunity to revisit those debates. We talked a little bit about that here today and in the series, and an occasion for us to really try to rethink that policy and come back to what many of us were saying at that time, why war was not necessary, and the fact that there were real alternatives to work through the United Nations and the international community. So this is a big challenge for us. I think it's also an opportunity for us, especially at the Keough School, as we're developing our policy studies profile, to really try to take on this challenge and to work together as scholars across disciplines here, but also with other researchers around the country, the Quincy Institute, and with other universities. So we'll be moving this forward in the coming months, and hope that all of you will work together. And so let me again thank everyone who's been involved, and especially Mahan and Dean Appleby for the support for this series. Thank you all.